so we're going to just talk about reading here, and then we're going to go to analysis and the prove it part, and that's where we're going to, I'll go to the quotations.
Okay.
Alrighty. So we both still at Q?
You look beautiful.
Good. Okay,
I'm thinking I
we're
should
gonna,
have bought
we're
this
going to
seat.
be so famous right now. Okay, alright. Okay, we're going to take a few moments now to talk with Christy about scaffolding, the close reading, the comprehension of this long and difficult text for third graders. Now I know there are audiobooks out there, there's a movie out there, I don't know if you used any of that to scaffold comprehension, maybe in the middle or the end. I'd love to hear about how you used any of those tools. But let's just talk about what was your sort of philosophy when you began, how am I going to get this across to the kids? How am I going to engage them? Like,
Sure. Well, I decided I was going to do this as a read aloud, that we would sit at the carpet every day and we would read at least a chapter. And as the students were reading to me, I would take anecdotal notes about their skills of reading. But the next day, after we read the chapter, I would encourage comprehension and talk, just throw little questions out there. But before I would ever move on to the next chapter, we would go back and analyze the entire chapter to make sure that they clearly understood the difficult text and that they were making the connections, that they were inferencing. I would pass out comprehension cards, very simple
right, we're going to
ones
show
first.
some of these. And you started out with the simple DOK
Yes.
1 and 2 questions.
Yes.
What is happening here in
Make
the
a
story?
connection. Who are the characters? Where is the setting? And you really take for granted that they come in remembering all of those skills, but sometimes
From chapter
they
to chapter
don't.
even.
So yes. But then
Was there, let me ask you, was there any independent reading? With this complex text, was it mostly read aloud, or did they have chunks that they did in jigsaw or in small groups?
every now and then I would give them a chapter to read in their small group, but most of the text was read together on the carpet, where I was just letting them take turns reading so that I could hear them read, I could hear their fluency, their expression, their decoding skills, and then I could also monitor and lead the comprehension. I wanted to.
Okay, so it was read aloud, but it wasn't just you reading aloud. You would take a turn and model fluency, and then they would take turns and you would take notes.
And some days I didn't even take a turn. They may read and I may say, hey, I want to read this back to you. And I would reread the sentence and say, can you make it sound like that? And then they would just reread that same sentence.
Excellent.
But I wanted to monitor their comprehension. I wanted to teach them to ask questions while they were reading. And the only way I knew to do that was guiding them through it because they've never done
Modeling,
this before.
yes, that's the way it's done.
I took comprehension questions, the how and why
Yes.
questions. I put them on sticky notes. I passed them out, put them in groups of 2 to 3. I would let them read the text or the chapter. They had already read it prior, but I would let them read it to find the answer because they had to prove to me, even if it was not right there in the text, they had to show me where they inferred from the text or where it was right in the text. They had to be able to prove it to me that they found the answer, where they found it, and why that said what they think it said.
You know, one of the exciting things about Common Core is that as a former high school teacher, I'm listening to what you're doing with these third graders, and I'm thinking that's what I wanted my AP Lang students to do in the 11th grade. And we used to, I think of it in much more in silos of, well, in the later grade, we're going to ask them who's the boy in the story, where's the town, and we didn't ask the how and why questions
Right.
until 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th grade. I love that we're asking them now because why not?
It's amazing to hear their thinking and that they can be trained in that manner, that we just have to not
to have
be
an
afraid.
opinion, to be
Yes.
an engaged reader and not just a passive learner, and when you're asking them how and why, they're bringing something to the plate. They're not
Right.
regurgitating a fact, which I think is wonderful. I
Right.
love seeing that it happens so effectively this early on. So you would scaffold that sort of analytical understanding by modeling that and asking the questions as you go along, but you're also hitting standards like fluency
Yes.
just naturally as you go along.
Right.
Okay, so we're going to share these cards. So in their independent groups, they're going to be answering these lower level DOK
Yes.
questions.
And you can use these for every single chapter. Who are the characters? What is the problem? And we cannot take for granted that they automatically know these skills, even
Right,
though
we can't
we've
begin
moved,
with the how and why
yes,
questions in grade 3.
Yes,
Right.
and even though we've moved to that level of rigor, we still have to remember that they have to be reminded about characters and setting and plot. So
And even learning those terms, I think,
absolutely, absolutely. This is just they have to make a connection, text-to-text connection, so the three of them would get together, make a connection. One would have to summarize the chapter, one group would have to write about the problem in the chapter. And the beauty of it all was they did one activity, but then they were able, when we came back together, they were able to listen to each group.
So they jigsawed the expert groups.
And so they still received all the practice, but they only had to do one of the questions.
Which is the beauty of that activity.
So.
Now, what I see in the evolution of that activity is that you go from that to you take them to a pretty sophisticated how and why
I do.
sort of questions here. So share some of this with us. Talk to me about this activity in general. Like, is this a rubric here?
This is a rubric because this was actually an assessment that the class took when they finished. However, these questions were so difficult, I felt I had to approach them ahead of time. And so what I did was I took the questions the same way I did this, but I wrote them on a sticky note, gave them to the group. They were responsible for finding the answers, and the answers are not just right there. This one says, how does Opal feel about her father? So they have to go in, first they have to write how she feels from what they've read, but then they have to go and prove it in the text and tell us, why do you think she feels that way? And they have to be able to say, because I read this, and this tells me that she must feel this way about her father. Some of the other questions were why.
And just to point out, one of the big shifts in Common Core, what might have 5 or 10 years ago, or last year, seemed like a really good assessment for this might be to come in and say, you just read a book about a kid and their dog. Tell us about a time when you had a pet.
Sure.
And then they would write into some extemporaneous, completely disconnected essay about a time when they had a pet. This is very much more rigorous when you're saying, I want to know about this character,
right,
and how she was shaped by the author, and what is the author trying to make you feel, and what devices do they use. It's really sophisticated.
It's very interesting that they don't understand character traits. That was very surprising to me in this first novel because of Winn-Dixie talked about character and character traits.
Yeah, it does.
And it was very interesting seeing them in their groups and thinking that the word curious meant something completely different than what it meant. It was very interesting, and it was an eye-opener for me.
So that's just one of the ways in which you were able to not only actually have third graders analyzing literary, strategies, but also author's purpose. But you also were getting in all of those foundational pieces and some of that language, the terminology, and all the stuff. So I love the holistic approach that you bring to this.
Sure.
We are going to spend just a little bit of time in the next video talking about something you touched on a couple times, this prove it thing,
okay,
and what happened with that. So that'll be next.
Okay.
Have you got little munchkins trying to get in?
I don't know what, they always hit my door. I have the worst room in the school building.
Okay, so it's not time for them to
No.
be back.